Imagine a 5-year-old child, barefoot in the frost, carrying a bundle of firewood that weighs almost as much as she does. Her hands are cracked, her lips are blue. She has not eaten since yesterday morning, and if she stops walking, if she sits down in the snow to rest, she will face serious consequences when she gets home. Not because her parents are cruel, because in her world, if she does not work, the family does not eat. This was not a punishment. This was simply childhood 700 years ago. In medieval Europe, between the 5th and the 15th centuries, nearly 1 out of every 2 babies died before the age of 5. The ones who survived were not coddled, they were not protected, they were not given a long, safe, playful childhood the way we understand it today. By the time a medieval child was 5 years old, she was already working. By 7, she was doing the labor of a small adult. By 12, she might already be married. By 14, she might already be a mother. And if she was unlucky, she would be dead before 20. This is the story of what childhood was really like in the Middle Ages. Not the fairy tale, not the painted picture of little peasants dancing around a maypole. The real story, the story of hunger, labor, fear, and a kind of early adulthood that arrived far too soon for the small shoulders it was placed upon. Stay with me until the end of this video, because the final chapter I'm going to share about how these children survived and sometimes even thrived will change the way you see the Middle Ages forever. This is a careful, historical look at a world that truly existed, a world that shaped everything that came after it, a world worth understanding, if only to remember how far we have come. Ready to step into it? Then let us begin. To understand medieval childhood, you first have to understand the world these children were born into. There were no hospitals, there were no pediatricians, there were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no clean water, no safe milk, no sterile instruments, no one who truly understood why a fever killed a baby or why a cut on a child's foot could turn black and end a small life in a week. There was only prayer, herbs, a village midwife with stained hands, and the cold, quiet statistics of death. In most medieval villages, between 40 and 50% of all children born alive did not live to see their 5th birthday. Let that number settle for a moment. Nearly half, 1 out of every 2 cradles was, sooner or later, an empty cradle. A mother who carried 6 children to term could reasonably expect to bury 3 of them before any of them had grown teeth enough to eat bread. Life expectancy across the medieval population as a whole was somewhere around 30 to 35 years. That figure sounds shocking until you realize that it was being dragged down more than anything else by the enormous number of children who died before the age of 10. A medieval adult who made it past childhood could, with luck, live into his 50s or 60s. But making it past childhood was, itself, the hardest battle most medieval people ever fought. There was no Disney in the Middle Ages, there was no safe nursery, there were no parents reading bedtime stories under warm lamps. There was only the fire in the middle of the floor, the smell of smoke and damp straw, and the endless, anxious waiting to see which child would be taken next. Fever, croup, dysentery, smallpox, measles, worms, infected teeth, a fall from a cart, a kick from a horse, a slip into the cooking fire. The accidents alone were endless. The diseases were worse. Infant mortality was so common that in some regions, families did not give a newborn a full name for the first few weeks, or even the first few months of life. What was the point of naming a child you might have to bury before the next full moon? In some villages, it was not unusual for 2 or 3 successive children to share the same name, because the first one had died before the second was born, and the second had died before the third. The name of a dead sibling was simply passed down, like a piece of clothing that was still too good to throw away. The birth itself was dangerous, dangerous for the child and dangerous for the mother. Women in medieval Europe gave birth at home on a straw mattress, sometimes on the bare floor, attended by a village midwife whose knowledge had been passed down by word of mouth, without books, without training, without any real understanding of what we would now call germs. The midwife's hands were washed, if she thought to wash them, in cold water from a bucket. Her tools were a knife and a length of rough linen. If something went wrong, and something went wrong in perhaps one birth out of every 20, there was very little she could do. A mother who bled too much bled out. A child that came the wrong way round died, and often took the mother with it. A fever that came in the days after the birth was a near certain sentence. In the records of monasteries and parish churches across medieval Europe, the same short phrase appears again and again, in different languages, in different centuries. She died in childbed. She died in childbed. She died in childbed. This was the world into which every medieval child was born. But if you were lucky enough to survive those early years, your troubles were only beginning. Because for the survivors, the next test was work. In a modern home, a 5-year-old child is playing. She is learning letters. She is drawing pictures with colored pencils. She is watching cartoons. She is eating a second breakfast of cereal poured from a brightly painted box. She's being told, gently, to put on her shoes before she goes outside to play. In a medieval home, a 5-year-old child was already working. Not occasional chores, not light help. Work. Real, daily, unpaid, expected, unending work. The kind of work that left her hands cracked, and her back sore, and her small body thinner than it should have been. By the age of 5, a peasant child in most of medieval Europe could already be trusted with dozens of tasks: fetching water from the stream or the well, gathering sticks for the fire, pulling weeds from the vegetable patch, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, chasing off crows from the new planted fields with a long stick and a loud voice, minding younger siblings who could not yet walk, sweeping the earthen floor, carrying messages to a neighbor on the other side of the village. By the age of 7, the work grew heavier. The child was now expected to tend animals. A boy might be sent out at dawn with a small flock of sheep or a single cow, walking them to pasture, watching them all day, protecting them from wolves and thieves and the wandering into planted crops that could cost his family a beating from the Lord Steward. He would eat what he could carry in a small cloth bundle. He would drink from a stream. He would sit on a rock and watch the animals, sometimes for 10 or 11 hours at a stretch, before walking them home again at dusk. If the family had no flock, the boy might be sent to help in the fields, scaring birds, picking stones, pulling weeds, gathering the fallen grain after the reapers had passed, leading the ox in a straight line while his father pushed the plough. These were not occasional adventures. These were the rhythm of his life. A girl of 7 was already being taught everything her mother knew. How to spin wool on a hand spindle, a task that would follow her, walking or sitting, for the rest of her life. How to card wool, how to mend a torn tunic, how to knead bread dough, how to pluck a chicken, how to salt a piece of pork, how to keep a pot of thin porridge simmering over a low fire, how to wash clothes in the cold water of a stream and pound them clean with a wooden bat, how to carry a younger child on her hip while doing all of these things at once. There were no schools for these children. Schools in the Middle Ages existed almost entirely for the sons of nobles, for future priests, and for a tiny class of wealthy merchants in the larger towns. For 90 to 95% of the medieval population, formal education did not exist at all. A peasant child did not learn to read. She did not learn to write. She did not learn her letters or her numbers in any organized way. What she learned was how to work. What she learned was how to survive. And in the towns and the cities, the work could be even harder. In the growing cities of medieval Europe, in London, in Paris, in Florence, in Cologne, in the great cloth-weaving centres of Flanders, poor children were set to forms of labour that, by every modern standard of child welfare, would be completely unacceptable today. They swept chimneys. Small boys chosen for their size were sent crawling up inside the narrow, soot-black chimneys of wealthy houses, scraping away the thick layer of burnt residue with a stiff brush and their own raw fingers. The soot got into their lungs. It got into their eyes. It got into cuts on their skin that never fully healed. Many developed terrible coughs that followed them for the rest of their lives. The work was dangerous in every possible way, and accidents were sadly common in an age that had no real understanding of workplace safety. They worked in the mines, in the silver mines of Central Europe, in the tin mines of Cornwall, in the coal pits that were already beginning to be dug in parts of England. Children as young as 6 or 7 were sent into the deep, narrow tunnels where adults could not easily fit. They carried baskets of ore, they held candles, they opened and closed small ventilation doors in the dark, sitting alone for 12 hours at a time, waiting for the next cart to pass. The air was bad, the tunnels collapsed. The children coughed black phlegm and grew stunted, and sometimes did not grow at all. They worked in the cloth trade. In the weaving towns of Flanders and northern Italy, poor children were bound by apprenticeship contracts to the owners of small workshops. They carded wool. They wound thread onto bobbins until their fingers bled. They worked from before dawn until after dark, in rooms lit only by the grey light of a small window and the smoky flicker of a tallow candle. They slept on the floor beside their looms. They ate thin soup out of a shared wooden bowl. If they were slow, they were harshly corrected. If they tried to run, the consequences were worse still, and those consequences, by modern law, would be unthinkable. They worked in taverns. They carried water and firewood for innkeepers. They scrubbed pots in monastery kitchens. They turned spits of roasting meat in the kitchens of the wealthy, crouched beside the open fire for hours, their faces red and their eyes streaming from the heat. They begged in the streets. They sold small loaves of bread from trays slung around their necks. They ran errands through mud and rain for merchants who paid them with a crust. By the age of 10, a poor medieval child in town or in country was already a worker. She had already spent half her short life in labour, and the hardest years in many cases were still ahead of her. Let that comparison settle for a moment. In a modern home, a 10-year-old is in the 5th grade. She is learning fractions. She is playing on a soccer team. She is riding her bike to a friend's house. She is picking out her own breakfast cereal. Her biggest worry might be a test on Friday, or whether the other girls will like her new shoes. A medieval 10-year-old was swinging a sickle. A medieval 10-year-old was carrying a pail of water from the well, spilling half of it on the way back, and being scolded for the waste. A medieval 10-year-old was sitting in the dark of a weaving shed in Flanders, winding thread onto a bobbin for 14 hours, fingers bleeding, back aching, stomach empty. A medieval 10-year-old in one part of Europe or another had already begun her apprenticeship in adulthood, and there was no going back from it. There are records that survive from the guilds of the medieval towns. Careful, dry, bureaucratic records written down by men who were not trying to move anyone's heart. These records list in many cities across Europe the ages at which children were bound by legal contract into apprenticeships. 7 years old for a cloth worker in Florence in the 1400s, 8 years old for a chimney sweep in Paris, 6 years old, in one surviving English document, for a small boy bound to a pewterer in London, whose master received a fee from the boy's family in exchange for promising to house him, feed him, and teach him the trade. The boy, under the terms of the contract, was bound for 7 years. He would be 13 when he was free again, if he survived. But work, for all its cruelty, was not the worst thing that could happen to a medieval child. The worst thing was hunger. In the modern world, when a child is hungry, a parent opens a cupboard, a refrigerator hums in the corner, a shop down the street sells bread and milk at any hour, a government office in most places will provide food if everything else fails. Hunger, for most modern children in wealthy countries, is something that happens for a few hours between meals, not a shadow that follows them from one winter to the next. The Middle Ages, hunger was a way of life. For the children of the rural poor, and that was most medieval children, food was always limited, always uncertain, and always about to run out. A peasant family survived on a narrow diet of grain, rye, barley, oats, ground into coarse flour, baked into heavy, dark bread, boiled into a thin porridge called pottage, flavoured with whatever vegetables the garden had produced: cabbage, leeks, onions, peas, beans, a little salt, if the family could afford it, a small piece of salt pork or bacon on a good day, a handful of apples in the autumn, a piece of cheese sometimes if there was a cow and the cow had milk to spare. Meat, in most peasant households, was a rare luxury. Fresh meat, even rarer. A chicken was too valuable for its eggs to be killed for its flesh unless it had stopped laying. A pig was slaughtered once a year, in the late autumn, and its meat was salted or smoked and stretched across the entire winter and spring. A cow, if the family had one, was kept for its milk, not its flesh. Fish, in villages near rivers or the sea, could add protein to the diet, but the fat rivers and the rich coastal waters often belonged, by law, to the local lord. And every winter, every single winter, the food ran low. Late winter and early spring were called in many parts of medieval Europe the hungry months. The harvest of the previous year had been eaten, the stored grain was running out, the new crops were not yet ripe, the animals were thin, the cows gave little milk, the hens laid few eggs, the cold still clutched the earth, and in the villages the fires burned low, and the bowls of pottage grew thinner, and the bread grew coarser, and mothers watched their children with a tight, quiet fear in their eyes. In a good year, the family simply tightened its belt and waited for the spring. In a bad year, children died. And then there were the terrible years. The years when the harvest failed completely. The years when cold, wet summers rotted the grain in the fields before it could ripen. The years when cattle plagues swept through the villages and killed the animals that remained. The years when war, or bandits, or a greedy lord, or all three at once, took what little the peasants had managed to save. The most famous of these is the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For 3 terrible years across almost all of northern Europe, the summers were cold and wet and the harvests failed, one after another. Bread became so expensive that ordinary working people could no longer afford it. Lords who had stored grain hoarded it or sold it at enormous prices. In some regions, the price of a loaf of bread rose 8 times, 10 times, 20 times over what it had been. The poor could not pay. They ate acorns, they ate bark, they boiled old leather to soften it and chewed it like bread. They ate grass, they ate rats, they ate dogs and cats when the dogs and cats had not already starved. They ate whatever they could find, and still they died. The chroniclers of those years wrote of corpses lying beside the roads, of children begging in the doorways of houses where the people inside were themselves dying, of parents unable to feed their babies and unable to bear the crying, and, in the darkest accounts, of parents who abandoned their children in the hope that someone, somewhere, might feed them. It is estimated that the Great Famine killed between 10 and 25% of the population in some regions of Europe. Millions of people, many of them children, an entire generation of small faces gone quietly in the hungry years before the Black Death came 30 years later to take more of them still. This was the shadow over medieval childhood. Not the exception, the rule. Every peasant child grew up knowing that hunger was a thing that could, in any given year, simply arrive. Every peasant child knew what an empty stomach felt like. Every peasant child had, by the time she was 10, already watched someone in her own family grow weak and thin and quiet and eventually stop moving. Hunger also changed the body of a growing child in ways that were written permanently into the bones. Modern archaeologists studying medieval graveyards have found the evidence again and again. The skeletons of peasant children from the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries show it plainly. Bones that are smaller than they should be, teeth whose enamel is marked with horizontal lines, one for each year of severe hunger. Growth rings, almost like the rings of a tree, recording the winters when there was not quite enough. Adults in medieval cemeteries are often short, not because medieval people were genetically small, but because their bodies had been starved into shortness during the years when they should have been growing. A modern child, given enough food, grows into her full genetic height. A medieval child, given not quite enough food, grew into a smaller, thinner version of herself, and that smaller, thinner body was the one that then had to carry her through adult labor, childbirth, and old age. And in the darkest corners of medieval Europe, when hunger had gone far enough, families made choices that are almost impossible to imagine today. They sent their youngest children away, not in large numbers, not in every village, but in the worst years, in the poorest regions, in the famines and the wars and the sieges. It happened. A desperate father, facing the collapse of an entire family, might send one of his younger children into the service of a wealthier household, into a distant apprenticeship, or into the care of a monastery, in exchange for a small sum of grain or coins the child would eat. The remaining family might survive the winter, and the small figure who had been sent away would carry, for the rest of a short life, the memory of the day the family door had closed behind her. This was not considered cruelty by everyone who saw it. It was considered, in some cases, a terrible mercy, a way of saving what could be saved, a choice between one grief and many. That was medieval poverty. That was medieval childhood for the poorest of the poor. And yet, the work and the hunger and the fear were not the only things that set medieval childhood apart from our own. There was something else, something stranger to modernize and in some ways more disturbing than all the rest. Medieval childhood ended early, not slowly, not gradually, not with the soft transitions we now call adolescence. It ended in many cases with a single ceremony, a single contract, a single night, marriage. In medieval Europe, the legal age of marriage was, under the rules of the church, 12 for girls and 14 for boys. That was not the age at which marriage became possible. That was the age at which it became fully binding. Below those ages, betrothals, formal engagements, could be arranged between much younger children, sometimes infants, especially among the nobility, where marriages were not about love but about land, alliance, and inheritance. A noble girl of 5 might be promised by her father's signature on a parchment to a boy she had never met, living in a castle 300 miles away. A noble boy of 7 might be sent to the household of his future father-in-law to be raised alongside the girl he would one day marry. These were not strange exceptions. These were the normal mechanics of a system in which children were counters on a very serious board. Among the peasantry, the ages were usually higher. A peasant girl might marry at 16 or 17, a peasant boy at 19 or 20. But in the lower classes, in the towns, and especially in the south of Europe, marriages at 12 or 14 or 15 were not unusual at all. And in every class, the idea that a 12-year-old girl could be a wife and that a 14-year-old boy could be a husband was simply accepted as the normal shape of life. Think about what that meant. By modern standards, a 12-year-old is still very much a child, and yet, in the eyes of the medieval law, the church, and the village, she was now considered a full adult. She was expected to run a household, to manage servants if her new family had them, or to do all the work herself if they did not. She would often become a mother within a year or two. The transition, by every measure we would use today, was far too sudden. Modern historians and ethicists universally agree that the practices of that era would be utterly unacceptable in our own time, and rightly so. A 14-year-old boy, still growing, still thin-limbed and soft-cheeked, was suddenly regarded as a husband, a head of household, expected to work the fields, to answer to the Lord, to pay the taxes, to defend his home, to carry a knife at his belt and use it if he had to. There was no adolescence. There was no long period of learning who you were, of trying out different lives, of failing and growing. There was childhood, and then, with almost no transition, there was adulthood. A small body, barely grown, was pushed across a line, and everything expected of a full adult was expected of it from that moment on. Some of these unions over time grew into real affection. Two young people placed together by their families could learn each other, could build a household that lasted for 50 years. But many were simply arrangements made by parents for reasons of land, of debt, or of alliance between families. Many were pairings that no one on either side had freely chosen. Once the ceremony was concluded and the priest had blessed the joined hands, medieval law gave a young wife almost no way out. Her work, her property, and in most regions her very name, belonged now to her husband's household. If he was kind, she was fortunate. If he was not, the legal protections she would have today simply did not exist. Noble arrangements were even more openly political. A great lord negotiated the future of his young daughter the way he negotiated a treaty with a neighbor. The parchments were read out, the dowry was agreed, the seals were attached. Chroniclers of the medieval courts describe, without any apparent concern, the tears of young brides on the morning of their departure. One 13th century account describes a noble girl being lifted onto a horse by her own brother because she was weeping too hard to climb up on her own. The chronicler calls this a picture of youthful modesty. He does not pause on it any further. It was, to him, the ordinary running of the world. To our eyes, of course, it looks very different, and that difference is exactly why we are having this conversation today. And beneath this early adulthood ran another layer of harshness that is difficult for a modern reader to accept. Medieval society approached discipline and correction in ways that, by today's understanding of child welfare, were clearly wrong, and that we would never tolerate now. A peasant child who disobeyed was physically punished. A boy who fell asleep while watching the sheep faced strict consequences when he came home. An apprentice who broke an expensive tool was harshly corrected by his master. A schoolboy in a monastery or a cathedral school who failed to memorize his Latin verses was punished by the teacher. These corrections were not considered mistreatment by the standards of that era, They were considered part of education itself. A proverb of the age said in many languages across Europe that love, true love, required strictness. We know today how profoundly misguided that belief was, but it was the cultural assumption of the entire medieval world. Public punishments for older children and teenagers who broke the law were sometimes severe as well. In the towns, young people caught stealing might be placed in the stocks alongside adults, their wrists and ankles held in the wooden frame while the community looked on. The medieval legal system did not recognize the modern distinction between a child and an adult offender, and the consequences reflected that. Historians today view these practices as one of the clearest examples of how far our understanding of childhood has, thankfully, advanced. Beyond the strictness of the age, there were the ordinary dangers of the medieval world. Plague, which returned in waves after 1347 and reshaped entire generations for centuries afterward. War, which moved through villages like a slow flood, burning houses and scattering families across the roads. Bandits, who roamed the forests and were a constant threat to travelers of any age. Wolves, which in bad winters came close to the villages and were a real danger to anyone sent alone to gather firewood at the edge of the trees. And over all of these dangers sat the quiet, constant presence of the church, telling every child, from the moment she could understand words, that her soul was in danger, that sin was everywhere, that hell was real, that the fires beneath the earth were waiting for anyone who disobeyed, that her dead brother, who had not been baptized in time, might be trapped forever in a place of shadow, that she herself might be taken at any moment, and that her only hope lay in confession, in penance, in the sacraments of the priest. This was not a distant idea for medieval children. This was the air they breathed. The pictures painted on the walls of the village church showed demons dragging souls into flaming pits, with claws in their backs and terror in their eyes. The sermons preached on Sundays described the tortures of hell in careful, terrifying detail. The prayers taught to children at bedtime asked, in plain words, that God would protect them from death during the coming night, because death was always close. A modern child goes to bed and is told that she is loved, that she is safe, that the morning will come, and everything will be fine. A medieval child went to bed and prayed, in words she had been taught almost before she could speak, that if she died before the dawn, her soul would not be lost. That was the weight placed on the small shoulders of every child in medieval Europe. And yet, and this is the part that we must say honestly, medieval childhood was not only darkness. For all the hunger, for all the labor, for all the fear, medieval children played, they laughed, they loved, and were loved. Families in the Middle Ages were not loveless assemblies of bodies around a fire. The letters and sermons and poems and chronicles that survive from the period are full of parents mourning dead children with a grief that would be instantly recognizable today, of fathers carving small wooden toys for their sons, of mothers singing lullabies that were passed down word for word across centuries, some of which are still sung in remote villages today. Children in medieval villages had games. They played with hoops of bent wood, rolling them along with a stick. They played with carved dolls, stuffed with straw. They played ball games with pigs' bladders blown up and tied off at the neck. They climbed trees. They fished in streams with lines of twisted horsehair. They raced each other in the village lanes. They chased each other around the stacks of hay in the summer and threw snowballs at each other in the winter. They invented games with stones and bones and sticks, the same way children have always invented games. They had festivals. On feast days, the whole village came together. There was music. There were dances. There were sweet cakes baked once a year for a special saint's day that a child would remember for the rest of her life. There were processions in which children walked behind the priest in white tunics, scattering flowers. There were May days and midsummer nights and the great 12 days of Christmas, when even the poorest household tried, if it could, to give its children a small pleasure. And some children, even the poor ones, could rise. The medieval world was harsh, but it was not completely closed. A peasant boy who showed an unusual intelligence might be noticed by the parish priest and sent, with his parents' blessing, to a monastery school, where he would learn to read, to write, to chant the Latin services, and to begin the long climb that could eventually make him a cleric, a scribe, even a bishop. A skilled apprentice in a town might, by the age of 25 or 30, become a journeyman, and eventually a master in his own right, owning his own workshop and employing apprentices of his own. A beautiful peasant girl might catch the eye of a wealthier farmer or even a minor gentleman and marry into a household with more comfort than her parents had ever known. And in the noble world, children could rise higher still. A boy sent at 7 as a page to the castle of a great lord, serving at table, running errands, learning to ride and to fight, could, by 14, be a squire. By 21, he could be knighted. John of Gaunt, the son of an English king, began his noble training in the household at the age most peasant boys began following the plough, and ended his life one of the richest and most powerful men in all of Europe. He was an extreme example, but he was an example. The medieval world allowed, sometimes, for a small child to climb. The problem was that 90% of them or more did not climb. They ran every day of their short lives just to stay in the same place, to eat the same thin pottage, to sleep in the same crowded bed, to work the same tired land, to face the same illnesses, to bury their own children when their turn came, the way their parents had buried theirs. So, after all of this, the question we are left with is a heavy one. Would you rather have been born a child in the Middle Ages or in the age of antiseptics, cartoons, and school buses? Would you rather have carried a bundle of firewood at 5 or a backpack at 5? Would you rather have married at 12 or watched a cartoon about princesses at 12? Would you rather have buried your little brother in a village churchyard or never had to imagine such a thing at all? The honest answer, for most of us, is obvious. And yet, it is worth remembering that the children of the Middle Ages were not a separate species. They were not a different kind of human being. They were not made of tougher stuff. They were exactly like the children you know today, small, tender, curious, easily frightened, easily delighted, easily hurt. They cried when they were hungry, and they laughed when they were tickled, and they wept when their mothers died, and they held on to small wooden toys at night as if those toys could protect them from the dark. They carried a whole world on their small backs, and most of them carried it for a very short time, before the ground quietly opened beneath them and took them back. That was medieval childhood, not the fairy tale, not the costume drama, the truth. And the truth, like the life those children lived, is harder than most of us had imagined. Now, I want to hear from you. Which part of medieval life surprised you the most? The early work at 5 years old, the hunger, the early marriages, the strictness of the age, the quiet acceptance that so many children would not reach adulthood. Leave a comment below and tell me what stood out to you. If you learned something today, if this video gave you a new respect for the childhoods that came before our own, and for how far society has progressed since, tap the like button. It really does help the channel. And if you want more honest, carefully researched stories from the real medieval world, not the Hollywood version, then subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss what is coming next, because the past is stranger and darker and more human than almost any of us were taught, and there is still so much of it left to walk through together. Until next time.